The hall was hushed with expectation, and in that anticipation lay the promise of change. Even the torches flickering against the walls of the great council chamber seemed to burn with a new intensity, as if every flame understood that history was poised on a knife point. Lords, ladies, and knights from all corners of the realm had gathered at the summons, an invitation whispered by ravens, sealed with wax, and marked with the sigils of the major houses. They came draped in their finest garb, determined not to betray the uncertainty in their hearts. Yet no matter how they tried to hide their sentiments, everyone's eyes, from the most ancient lord of a forgotten keep to the young squire clinging to his master's side, darted warily toward the dais at the head of the hall. The dais was set with 2 chairs of equal height, neither of them the Iron Throne but both symbolic. One seat was intended for the current ruler of the 7 kingdoms, whoever it might be recognized as in the aftermath of war and strife, and the other for the hand or some official meant to stand as advisor. Yet on this day, those seats remained ominously empty. Instead, the entire assembly of Westeros's nobility sat facing a stage that carried the promise of revelation. Rumors had circulated for months. Something about a secret lineage, a potential heir, a hidden truth that could reshape alliances, vow vengeance, or unify the entire realm without the clang of swords. Jon Snow stood near the rear entrance of the hall, cloaked in dark furs despite the southern warmth. The thick leather and wolf-pelt shoulders gave him a stark, northern presence, immediately recognizable even from a distance. His eyes swept across the crowd, seeing faces both curious and contemptuous, sympathetic and skeptical. He noted the proud lion of House Lannister on a handful of doublets, the golden rose of Tyrell pinned to a lady's gown, the gray direwolf of Stark embroidered on the broad chest of a northern bannerman, and the sun and spear of Dorne's delegation glimmering in their jewelry. Every major house was present, as well as 100 lesser lords. He felt the weight of their gathered attention, even though not a word had yet been spoken in the official proceedings. Seated to one side were his siblings, or those he had always considered siblings. Sansa Stark in a dark gown embroidered with silver thread, her red hair carefully braided around her shoulders. She sat poised with dignity, no trace of fear in her eyes. Next to her was Arya, smaller, quieter, but exuding the watchfulness of a trained wolf. Bran Stark, his face the most inscrutable of all, stared forward with an unreadable calm. The Lord of Winterfell, though named king in the north once, now was something more than that. He carried a gravity that went beyond title or even mortal knowledge, shaped by his time beyond the wall and the green sight that dwelled in him. Near them sat Tyrion Lannister, his clever gaze darting between the assembled lords and Jon himself. The dwarf's face betrayed a silent kind of expectation, a readiness to see how the pieces would fall on the board of power. Further off, Davos Seaworth fiddled with his gloved hands, occasionally looking over to Brienne of Tarth, who sat in solemn readiness, apparently prepared for trouble should it arise. The hush in the hall deepened with every passing moment. Jon knew what was being asked of him. A peaceful claim, a peaceful transition, if at all possible. For months, even years, the realm had been hammered by war after war. The fight against the dead had united them briefly, though the scars from that conflict ran deep. And in the final throes of the war, the destruction wrought by dragons had blackened the skies, torn families apart, and left King's Landing in ruins. The seat of power, once so alluring in the eyes of conquerors, now stood as a battered relic of old glory. Jon's heart twisted at the memory of it all. He had never asked for power. He had never sought to be anything more than a loyal son, a brother, a man of the Night's Watch, sworn to protect the living from threats beyond imagination. But fate and the truths of his parentage had thrust him onto a stage he would have rather avoided. He breathed in slowly, recalling the final words of the council given to him before entering the hall. Sansa had been the first to urge caution. If he was going to speak the truth, he needed to do it in a manner that could not be twisted by rumor or disbelief. Tyrion had warned him that simply brandishing a secret lineage could spark chaos, because blood claims in Westeros were seldom accepted at face value. Davos had remained quiet, yet supportive, trusting in Jon's integrity but worrying for what might follow. Each had offered advice in their own way, shaped by their experiences with betrayals, illusions, and half-truths that had ignited entire wars. When Jon took his first steps forward, into the open center of the council chamber, the movement attracted every eye like a magnet. The hush grew so complete that even the clank of a distant guard's armor resonated through the space like a thunderclap. Outside, the skies of King's Landing were blessedly calm. No roars of dragons, no swirling snows. Just a clear day that carried a gentle breeze through the ruined walls and half-rebuilt corridors of the Red Keep. He knew it was time. The Great Council was convened to settle the matter of succession, once and for all, so that the realm might be spared further bloodshed. The lords who had come were prepared to cast their votes, to weigh alliances, to consider who might next ascend the Iron Throne, or what was left of it. In his chest, Jon felt the steady pounding of his heart, reminding him he was still just a man, no matter what titles or claims might be thrust upon him. He had been prepared to refuse, to abdicate, to remove himself from the deadly game. Yet those around him, and some part of himself he couldn't fully ignore, believed that if he took the mantle, peacefully, transparently, he could finally bring the realm to a unity that had eluded it for too long. He stopped at the front, near the dais, and turned to face the crowd. Their voices had died into an expectant hush. He looked at them each in turn, seeing lords of the Reach, the Stormlands, the Vale, the North, the Westerlands, the Iron Islands, the Riverlands, and Dorne. Old men, young heirs, battle-worn knights, and cunning ladies who had survived more intrigues than any man. He cleared his throat, the dryness in his mouth making him swallow. "My lords, my ladies," he began, his voice neither a roar nor a whisper, but something that carried to every corner of the chamber with quiet determination. "I come before you in all honesty, and with no wish to bring further grief to this realm." He glanced back at his family, Starks by upbringing, but one of them was his brother in truth, for Rhaegar Targaryen's blood ran in his veins. Bran offered a tiny nod of encouragement. Jon continued, "I was raised as a Stark, though I never bore the name. I served at the Wall, and I fought for the living against the dead. When the wars ended, the truth of my parentage was revealed to me, a secret kept by my mother's brother, my uncle Ned Stark. I know you have heard rumors, half-truths, bits of gossip. Perhaps you dismissed them, or perhaps you believed them but thought them inconsequential. Today, I come to tell you the full truth in front of all of you, so there is no doubt." A stir went through the crowd, like leaves rustling just before a gust of wind. Faces turned wary, curious, doubtful. Some might have guessed what he would say, but not all believed it. It was one thing to hear whisperings that this was Aegon Targaryen, the last living male of that ancient line. It was another to hear it proclaimed in a formal council. "My true father," Jon went on, forcing himself to speak clearly, "was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. My mother was Lyanna Stark of Winterfell. I was born under a legitimate marriage arranged between them in secret, though to the world it appeared otherwise. Lord Eddard Stark took me as his own, to shield me from those who might harm a Targaryen heir. He bore the shame and the dishonor for my sake, so that Robert Baratheon, the usurper—" Jon paused, aware of the Baratheon banners present. He inclined his head respectfully, not wishing to rile them unnecessarily. "Would not see me as a threat and try to end my life, as so many Targaryens before me were hunted down." The murmur swelled then, surging on the edges of panic or excitement. One could see heads leaning together, quick words exchanged in subdued voices, the flicker of calculation on the faces of older lords who had lived through Robert's rebellion. Some looked pale, remembering the sack of King's Landing, the vile killing of children. Others, like the delegates from Dorne, felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, for Rhaegar had once been their princess's husband. The memory of Elia Martell's murder was fresh in their minds, even if it occurred decades ago. Jon gave them a moment, seeing the swirl of reactions. He forced himself to stand taller. "I have not come to cast vengeance upon anyone for old wounds. I have not come to incite war or bring dragons down upon this city. I have come only to tell you the truth, that I am Aegon Targaryen, the living heir of that line, and to humbly request your judgment. If you deem me unworthy, If you believe this realm would be better served by another, I will accept it. But I will not lie or hide the truth of my blood any longer. I have seen too many secrets lead to needless bloodshed." There was a hush in the wake of his words. No single lord or lady dared break it, until finally Tyrion Lannister rose from his seat among the advisors. The dwarf's voice carried an intellectual calm that was nonetheless tinged with suppressed tension. "My lords, my ladies," he said, "you have heard the man speak. You have heard the tales and the rumors. Some of you may demand proof, and proof will be provided. The knowledge Lord Bran Stark holds cannot be so easily dismissed, and there are documents, testimonies from those who aided in the secret wedding, as well as the recollections of the High Septon of that time. This is no idle rumor." Bran's eyes flashed, as though from some faraway vision. He inclined his head slightly, though he said nothing. The lords and ladies exchanged glances once more, and whispering returned in earnest. A few seats away, Samwell Tarly nervously clutched a leather-bound tome, presumably containing genealogical records or the High Septon's accounts. Jon could see the man's anxious face, flushed but determined. Sam had been the one to corroborate the story in the first place, discovering old scrolls that confirmed a quiet ceremony between Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Without Sam's diligence, the entire truth might never have been laid out so plainly. Finally, it was the Lady of the Vale, perhaps leading the delegation for House Arryn, who spoke. Her voice trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion, but it rang out clearly. "And what do you intend to do with this claim, Jon Snow, if we are to call you that any longer? Will you ask us to bend the knee to you as your father's father did with his dragons? Or do you wish for our peaceful acceptance?" Jon took a slow breath. "I wish for peace. I wish for no forced pledges or burnings. We have known enough war. It was my aunt's, Daenerys Targaryen's, ambition to break the wheel. Perhaps she went about it in a manner that left much suffering in her wake, but the idea behind it need not be lost. I do not seek to shatter houses or bring ruin, nor do I wish to call down dragons and fire. There is only one dragon left, Drogon, and he has not been seen in many moons. The truth of my name is more than a claim. It is a responsibility to see that the realm no longer bleeds." The hall echoed with anxious energy. Jon understood their doubt. Too many would-be monarchs had made pleasant-sounding promises, only to demand gold and men for endless wars. The Targaryen name itself was a storied legacy, one that had soared high in conquest but also dipped into madness, cruelty, and tyranny. But he could not change what was in his blood any more than he could change the course of the sun in the sky. All he could do was speak plainly, from his heart, the same way he had always led men in battle or negotiated alliances with wildlings. The Great Council erupted in discussion then, slowly at first, but soon with a fierceness that threatened to devolve into a cacophony of raised voices. Some lords, especially from the north, stood up to speak in Jon's favor, praising his leadership during the war against the White Walkers, citing his fairness and willingness to protect the realm at personal cost. Others, from the Western Lands or the Stormlands, voiced concern about a Targaryen's claim, recalling old wounds from the rebellion and from the more recent devastation. This was the exact possibility Jon had dreaded, that the realm might begin to fracture anew as people set old grudges and loyalties against each other. A call for order rang out from the dais, and Ser Brienne of Tarth, standing beside it, rapped the hilt of her sword against the stone to command silence. Slowly, haltingly, the voices quieted, though pockets of fierce debate still rippled through the crowd. Tyrion cleared his throat. "This council has assembled to consider the future of the realm. The question of legitimacy is paramount. But there is another question to address. Will the realm accept a Targaryen, even one who fought so valiantly at our side against the dead, as king? And if so, on what conditions?" Jon felt his chest tighten. The question was daunting, but it was fair. He had never desired a crown, and the realm had good reason to be wary of Targaryens. Their dragons had destroyed kings landing more than once in living memory. Mad King Aerys' atrocities still haunted older lords, and the more recent tragedy under Daenerys Targaryen remained fresh as a bleeding wound. But if the truth of his blood was out, and if the realm demanded that a Targaryen should once again occupy the Iron Throne, or at least some form of monarchy, then he wanted to offer them a path different from fear and subjugation. With a firmness that betrayed his own reluctance, Jon said, "I will submit to any terms that ensure peace and stability. If you demand councils, parliaments, or checks on the power of the crown, I will accept them. My aim is not tyranny. I have been a soldier, a brother of the Watch, a king in the north, and I have seen what absolute power can do to good people. I do not wish to rule alone, nor do I believe the realm can be governed by one person's will alone. Choose representatives. Allow each region to govern itself under a broader unity. Whatever shape you wish to give to the realm's governance, I will not stand in the way." This statement caused another wave of murmuring throughout the hall. Some doubted the sincerity of such an offer. Others, clearly intrigued, saw the potential for a reformed monarchy, one not reliant solely on bloodline and fear. The conversation ebbed and flowed, and Jon waited, his face calm, though inside he felt as though he balanced on a precipice. He recalled the countless nights spent in Winterfell's great hall, imagining that he was only a bastard, overshadowed by the name of Stark. Now here he stood, on the brink of claiming the very seat his father had once been destined for, but at a time when it might destroy the realm if handled poorly. Then a voice rose from the midst of the Northern Lords. Lady Mormont's cousin, or some other representative from Bear Island, for the fierce Lyanna Mormont herself had perished in the war. The new Lady Mormont was older, though not by too many years. She had a hardened expression, reminiscent of her younger cousins. "If the North recognizes your claim," she said, "will we still be subjected to the same taxes, the same interference from King's Landing that made so many in the North resentful in the past? We named you king in the North once, Jon Snow. Would you require us to kneel before you now that you carry Targaryen blood?" Jon let out a breath. "I understand how proud the North is, and how fiercely it guards its independence. If the North wishes to remain part of the Seven Kingdoms, I ask only that you do so willingly. I will not force your submission. After all that has happened, I've learned that an alliance must be built on trust and respect, not fear. If the North wishes to remain separate, I would not wish it so, but I will respect it. If you choose to be part of a unified realm, I give you my oath that any arrangement will be one that ensures the North's unique customs and needs are honored." This answer seemed to placate some Northern lords, though not all. Sansa cast Jon a subtle nod, as though acknowledging the tightrope he was walking. She understood the Northern mindset intimately, having seen how the region's isolation and harsh conditions forged a certain independence and a wariness of distant rulers. No doubt, she would have liked to keep the North separate, to rule as a queen there, but she also saw how exhausted the region was by war. A stable, well-led monarchy might serve them all better than continued division, especially if that monarchy was headed by a man who held Stark blood as well as Targaryen. Across the chamber, representatives from the Reach muttered among themselves, recalling the Targaryen alliances of old. House Tyrell had once profited greatly under Targaryen rule, but with the Tyrells nearly extinct, their distant cousins or allied families governed the fertile fields. They weighed the advantages of supporting a Targaryen king with a proven track record of honorable leadership, against the risk of once again bowing to a dynasty that might yield another mad king down the line. The Stormlands, too, were embroiled in recollection of the Baratheon rebellions, uncertain how to proceed. At last, after another call for order, the discussions narrowed into a more focused debate. Proof of Jon's parentage was demanded, and Samwell Tarly was brought forward to read from the archival record. He spoke of the High Septon's secret annulment of Rhaegar's previous marriage, the subsequent union with Lyanna Stark, and the sealed letter that confirmed the child's legitimate birth. Bran Stark, addressing the council with a voice that seemed to echo from some place beyond typical memory, detailed his visions as the three-eyed raven, describing precisely the night of Jon's birth in the Tower of Joy, the blood on the bedclothes, the whispered name from Lyanna's lips. The hall listened in rapt silence, an occasional gasp or exclamation escaping from those who had never considered that such a monumental secret could remain hidden for so long. When the last piece of evidence had been presented, the hush returned, thicker than before. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, remained standing, his expression solemn, as though he fully expected that the next words might condemn him or thrust him into a civil war he never wanted. He scanned the faces in front of him. Some stared at him with awe, others regarded him with doubt or fear. Others still appeared lost in thought, as though all their carefully laid plans were shifting beneath their feet like quicksand. Finally, it was Edmure Tully, older, wearier, but still sporting the proud bearing of Riverrun, who cleared his throat. "The realm has bled enough," Edmure said, his voice not particularly loud but carrying a certain heartfelt resonance. "We have fought each other for the sake of claims and crowns. We have endured the long night and seen how mortal we truly are, how fragile our kingdoms. If a new king must be chosen, why not choose one who has proven himself a man of honor, a man who gave up his own crown in the north for the sake of unity? He carries Stark blood, which many of us can attest to in his character, but he is also Targaryen by right, which is no small thing. Perhaps in him, the realm can finally find both ice and fire tempered into something stable. I, for one, will support him." Those words sparked more discussion, but they also provided a focal point for the council. One by one, or sometimes in small groups, lords and ladies began to declare themselves, some with immediate acceptance, others with grudging acquiescence, and a few with outright resistance. But that resistance waned as more and more recognized the futility of launching another war. The Targaryen name was not entirely welcomed, but if there was any Targaryen who might be accepted, it was the man who had saved the realm from the army of the dead and had shown no ambition for the throne previously. One stumbling block arose from the Westerlands, where a Lannister cousin questioned the loyalty of a Targaryen to the families that had killed his kin. Yet Tyrion, speaking on Jon's behalf, reminded them that Jon had already shown mercy and loyalty, even when he discovered the role that certain houses played in the murder of Targaryen children during Robert's rebellion. He could have demanded retribution, but he never did. He sought only to protect the living and unify them against the greater threat. This seemed to assuage some fears, albeit cautiously. Dorne's representatives showed the most ambivalence, recalling the fate of Elia Martell. Yet in quiet talks, which lasted some time, they expressed a subtle hope. If Rhaegar's line endured through Jon, then perhaps there was an opportunity to mend old grievances and usher in a new relationship between Dorne and the Iron Throne. Their wounds would never fully vanish, but many younger Dornish lords were ready to move forward, especially if guaranteed more autonomy and representation in a reformed council. The day wore on. The council took breaks, time to confer in side chambers, to drink watered wine, to reflect, to weigh the possibilities. Jon remained mostly silent, responding only when asked a direct question about how he intended to govern or what he would do to ensure peace. Always, he repeated his stance. He sought no vengeance, no forced subjugation. He only wished to bring an end to the cycle of brutality that had plagued Westeros. He was open to establishing a small council that genuinely represented every region, to ensuring that laws were fair, and to preventing the monarchy from amassing unchecked power. Some older lords regarded this talk as naive, or even dangerously revolutionary, but the tide was shifting in favor of compromise and healing. Too many wars had ravaged the realm for them to countenance more bloodshed. As twilight began to cast long shadows over the windows of the great council chamber, a final vote was called. Each delegation was to speak on whether they would accept Aegon Targaryen, Jon Snow, as king of the Seven Kingdoms. The North, after some hesitation from certain corners, voted in favor, led by Sansa's subtle nod, Arya's hawk-like stare lending silent support, and the general respect Jon had earned from northern bannermen. The Vale agreed, seeing as they had always been allied closely with the Starks and had once rallied to Sansa and Jon's cause. The Riverlands, guided by Edmure Tully's endorsement, concurred. The Westerlands, after Tyrion's arguments, provided a measured acceptance. The Reach also offered support, especially given that House Tarly's Samwell had vouched for Jon's honorable character. Dorne, with a measured dignity, lent its vote, eager perhaps to ensure a seat at the new council that would form. The Stormlands, though grudging, gave a nod of acceptance when it became clear that Robert Baratheon's direct line had ended, and that continuing conflict would serve no one. And so, by the time the last region declared its stance, the Great Council was nearly unanimous. Save for a few muttered dissents, individuals with personal grievances that could not overshadow the consensus. Jon felt a heavy numbness in his limbs, a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had not expected it to be so straightforward. He had braced himself for the possibility of having to walk away or to see the realm fracturing once more. But the momentum of unity was too strong to be denied, and the memory of shared peril against the dead and the destruction left by the last war loomed large in everyone's minds. The chamber fell silent again, as if collectively holding its breath, waiting for him to speak. He looked around at the lords and ladies, seeing in their eyes a mixture of hope, fear, weariness, and perhaps a spark of belief that a different future was possible. He recalled the words of Maester Aemon, the Targaryen who had served at the Wall. Love is the death of duty. Yet here he was, accepting a burden out of love for the realm and the duty he felt to protect it. It was a paradox, and he could not see an easy path. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that carried in the charged silence. You have chosen to trust me with this authority. I will do my utmost to prove worthy of it. But let it be known, this will not be the monarchy of old. I do not wish to sit idly on the Iron Throne, if it even remains. Let a new throne be forged if we must, or let the throne stand as a relic of what once was. Either way, I ask for your help, your counsel, and your voices in the governance of the realm. We need a new order that respects the diversity of our kingdoms, that ends the cycle of endless rebellion. He could see relief settling on some faces, caution lingering on others. In that moment, Bran, so silent through much of the proceedings, spoke in his serene way. The time for truths has come, he said, his voice soft yet undeniably resonant. The realm has nearly torn itself apart over old lies, half-truths, and illusions. You stand here on the threshold of a new era. Be certain that you do not repeat the mistakes of the past. For a moment, no one responded, but a quiet sense of agreement rippled through the air. Tyrion stepped forward, clearing his throat. Then let us finalize it. My lords and ladies, in the name of the Great Council, I proclaim, without further dissent, that this man, Aegon Targaryen, known to many as Jon Snow, is the rightful king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm. He paused, letting that declaration settle. May he serve the realm better than any who came before. There was applause from some quarters, uncertain murmurs from others, but the die was cast. Jon felt his heart pounding. He had said he would accept their will, and their will was now laid bare. He would be king. The finality of it settled on him like a cloak made of both steel and feather, heavy yet intangible. As the council formally concluded its vote, courtiers and stewards began moving about, preparing for what they thought would be an immediate coronation. However, Jon insisted on deferring any ceremony until King's Landing was more stable. The city was still half ruined from the final battles of the war, its people traumatized by the sight of dragonfire. He could not, in good conscience, don a crown in a broken city, parading about in regal pomp while so many suffered. Instead, he asked that the next day be spent discussing urgent measures to rebuild King's Landing, feed the displaced, and restore a semblance of order. Though some found this unorthodox, many recognized it as exactly the kind of leadership the realm needed. A king who placed practical needs ahead of ceremonies and feasts. Tyrion busied himself with the arrangements, Samwell Tarly with the mustering of resources, and Davos Seaworth with maritime logistics to bring grain and supplies from the Reach and the North. The rest of the day was consumed by hectic planning, letters dispatched by Raven, and the final dissolution of the council into smaller committees, each dedicated to a realm-wide problem. Jon found a moment's respite in a secluded corridor of the Red Keep. The once grand passages still bore the scorches of dragonfire and the rubble of partially collapsed walls. He removed his cloak to feel the warm southern breeze against his neck. His mind swam with the weight of what had happened. "Your Grace," came a familiar voice from behind him, tinged with the slightest hint of amusement. It was Sansa, She wore a half-smile that contained 1,000 unspoken thoughts. He turned. "Don't call me that," he said softly, his face reflecting a tired exasperation. She lifted an eyebrow, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's who you are now, or at least what you are. But not to me. To me, you'll always be Jon." He gave a nod of gratitude. Her acceptance, her presence, was a balm against the swirl of formality around him. "You supported me in the council." "Thank you," he said, "though I know you have your reservations." Sansa exhaled, glancing at a crack in the stone wall behind him. "I do, but I also believe no one is better suited. Or perhaps more accurately, no one is less unsuited. You never wanted the crown. That alone sets you apart from so many others who lusted after it." She reached out a hand and rested it lightly on his shoulder. "The North is behind you, but we also want certain guarantees. You understand." He placed his own hand over hers. "I do, and I promise I'll keep them." She studied him for a long moment, perhaps searching for any sign of the naive bastard boy he once was, or perhaps measuring the man who had emerged from trials unimaginable. "Then I'll hold you to that. Now come. People will be searching for you. There's no rest for the new king, it seems." He followed her back into the corridors, feeling the tug of duty stronger than any chain. Indeed, no rest awaited him. Over the next hours, he was guided from one discussion to the next. The state of the crown's finances in disarray, the distribution of grain to war-torn regions, the matter of rebuilding the city's water supply systems. Each new problem reminded him just how fragile peace could be. If resources ran short, if petty lords turned on each other, if an old vendetta flared, everything could unravel. But he pressed on, resolute, believing that perhaps, if the realm sensed an honest willingness to heal, they might rally around him. Late that evening, a makeshift feast was thrown in the largest surviving hall of the Red Keep. It was not a grand affair. The food was simple, the music subdued, yet lords and ladies gathered all the same, not to celebrate so much as to acknowledge a turning point, no matter how uncertain. Jon stood among them, accepting their words of reluctant congratulation, fielding hesitant toasts, all the while longing for the quiet of Winterfell's godswood. He caught sight of Arya, drifting at the fringes, wearing plain traveling clothes rather than a lady's gown. She looked at him with a small smile that said she understood how ill at ease he was in this environment. He returned a similar expression, grateful that not all Starks had changed. Tyrion sidled up to him, sipping from a cup of Dornish wine. "I must say, Your Grace, I didn't think I'd ever find myself in the service of another Targaryen, let alone one that half the realm seems actually inclined to tolerate." He chuckled softly. "Funny how fate has a twisted sense of humor." Jon sighed, swirling the watered wine in his own cup. "I'm grateful for your help. I don't know if I can do this, Tyrion." "Do what, precisely?" "All of it," Jon said, gesturing vaguely at the throng of courtiers, the half-ruined hall, the air thick with politicking. "Rule. Keep the realm together. Rebuild. Implement new laws so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. All the while ensuring that old grudges don't tear us apart again." Tyrion nodded, taking a contemplative sip. "You forget I served under Joffrey Baratheon, so I'm well aware that just about anyone could do a better job than he did. You have empathy, a sense of justice, and a willingness to listen to others. Rare qualities in a monarch. As long as you keep those qualities, you'll do better than most who sat the Iron Throne. The question is whether the burdens of the crown will crush those qualities out of you." Jon stared into his cup. "I won't let them, and I'll do my best to ensure you don't," Tyrion replied. "Think of me as your tether to reality, or perhaps your occasional jester, though I might be the one needing a jester after dealing with all these new committees. Regardless, you're not alone in this, Jon. You have wise counsel. Don't make the mistake of shutting us out." Jon nodded, feeling a small measure of confidence rekindle. The greatest danger he had seen in rulers was their isolation, the echo chambers of flattery that led them to cruelty or madness. He resolved then that he would not shut out advice or ignore the realm's needs, no matter how burdensome it became. The feast lasted late into the night, with many toasting the new king and others quietly plotting their next moves. By the time the hall cleared, Jon's head felt heavy, not from wine. He had sipped sparingly, but from the sheer weight of responsibilities and interactions. He made his way to the chambers hastily prepared for him. Gone were the grand Targaryen apartments once used by his aunt. Too many dark memories lingered there. Instead, he occupied a modest suite once used by a steward. He sank onto the bed, unlacing his boots in the dim light of a single candle. Sleep, however, was elusive. Memories of the day swirled behind his eyelids. The unblinking stares of the lords, the hush when he declared his parentage, the final moment when the realm declared him its chosen king. How had it come to this? Only a few years ago, he had been a man of the Night's Watch, convinced that his highest calling was to guard the wall. That calling had led him through betrayal and resurrection. He still remembered the cold steel of his comrades' daggers. Now he was supposed to lead all 7 kingdoms, to represent both House Stark and House Targaryen, to unify the realm in a fragile peace. It was a burden that made sleep an afterthought. Despite his reluctance, the exhaustion of the day eventually overcame him. His dreams were fitful, tangled with images of dragons and direwolves, crypts and burning cities, a silver-haired woman with tear-streaked cheeks, and a father he never knew, singing a song in a distant hall. When dawn came, he awoke feeling as though no time had passed at all. The next day began the immense task of reorganizing the realm. Lacking a formal small council, Jon convened an assembly of advisors and leading lords who would serve until a permanent body could be established. Tyrion Lannister naturally took a pivotal role. Samwell Tarly was named Grand Maester in practice, though formalities would come later. Davos Seaworth was assigned as Master of Ships, for there was no one else who commanded the trust he did, and the realm's naval power was in near-total disarray. Brienne of Tarth continued her duty as protector and eventually would be named Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, though for now, there were too few knights in the guard for an official ceremony. Sansa Stark, while hesitant to remain in King's Landing, recognized the necessity of her presence, at least for the immediate future. She assumed a key advisory role, assisting with negotiations between the North and the Crown. Arya, on the other hand, made it clear she did not plan to linger. She had come to see if Jon's claim would lead to more war. Now that peace seemed a possibility, she intended to explore west of Westeros, as she had always dreamed. But for the moment, she stayed close, ensuring no immediate threats lingered around her brother. Bran Stark offered guidance on matters both practical and mysterious. While his demeanor was distant, he possessed knowledge beyond the scope of ordinary men. He and Tyrion spoke at length about the logistics of distributing resources and rebuilding, factoring in everything from the cyclical patterns of farmland to the location of hidden caches of grain. Jon often noticed how some lords felt uneasy around Bran, sensing that he saw more than he let on. But unease gradually turned to respect, for Bran's insights consistently proved useful in stabilizing the realm. Rebuilding King's Landing became the immediate priority. The city that had once boasted 1 million souls was now a fractured husk, its population much reduced by war, famine, and flight. The rubble still contained unburied bodies in some quarters, and disease threatened to take root. Jon ordered a coordinated effort. Laborers cleared debris, mass graves were dug respectfully outside the city walls, and engineers repaired the aqueducts and sewers. Gold from the crown's treasury, what little remained, was supplemented by forced contributions from lords who had been hoarding wealth to finance future wars. Tyrion's silver tongue and Davos's sense of justice ensured that these contributions were gathered with minimal resistance. As days turned to weeks, a semblance of order emerged. People still looked at Jon with a mixture of wariness and gratitude, unsure whether he would turn into another tyrant. But bit by bit, he proved himself. He traveled through the city without a large retinue, listening to the pleas of commoners, ensuring food and water reached them. He refused to condone the harassment of any group, Targaryen loyalists or otherwise. Whenever disputes arose, he insisted on fair hearings. These acts did not go unnoticed. Cautious loyalty began to grow. Meanwhile, across the realm, Ravens flew in every direction carrying Jon's messages of reconciliation. The battered houses of the Stormlands were encouraged to rebuild their keeps, with help from the crown, in exchange for a pledge to assist the Riverlands in constructing new bridges and repairing roads destroyed in the wars. Dorne was promised greater autonomy in deciding local matters, renewing the pride of the Dornish, who had always resisted total assimilation. The Vale, mostly untouched by the final conflicts, offered grain shipments to the more devastated regions, forging trade routes that benefited them economically in return. The North, under Sansa's watchful oversight and supported by the Northern Lords, began the laborious process of recovering from the long night's ravages. Though the northern climate was harsh, the arrival of a more stable peace allowed them to focus on planting and trade, not war. Yet not all problems could be solved so cleanly. The Iron Islands remained restless, uncertain whether they wished to remain under the rule of the Iron Throne. They had known moments of independence before, and the new generation of Ironborn yearned for a resurgence of their old ways. Jon, recalling Theon Greyjoy's ultimate sacrifice, did not wish to see the islands break away entirely, but he recognized that forcing them to remain might spark conflict. Negotiations went back and forth, with emissaries traveling by sea to find a middle ground. Ultimately, it was agreed that the Iron Islands would have near-total autonomy in their local governance and maritime law, provided they swore not to engage in raids against the mainland and paid a modest tribute to maintain the unity of the realm. It was an uneasy compromise, but it staved off open rebellion. The Lannister hold on the Westerlands also required delicate handling. With Cersei gone and Jaime dead, Tyrion's presence as the new king's hand, though not yet formally named, brought a certain legitimacy. Some Lannisters resented him for his perceived betrayal of the family. But Tyrion's clever diplomacy, paired with Jon's willingness to forgive past slights, began to repair trust. Resources from Lannisport and the gold mines, though less fruitful than in ages past, proved vital in funding the reconstruction of King's Landing. In exchange, the crown took a relatively light hand with taxation, recognizing the need to avoid inflaming old hostilities. One of the more poignant challenges was dealing with the Targaryen loyalists who had hidden away after Daenerys' death. Many had fled or gone underground, fearing reprisals. In Jon, they saw both a beacon of hope and a reminder of how Daenerys' dream had ended. Some demanded that the memory of the Dragon Queen be honored. Her vision carried on explicitly. Jon, however, could not in good conscience celebrate the final horrors she had unleashed, even as he recognized her earlier accomplishments in breaking the chains of slavery across the narrow sea. He addressed these loyalists directly, assuring them that he would carry forward the spirit of justice that Daenerys once championed, but in a way that spared Westeros from the terror of fire and blood. It was a fine line to walk, and not all were satisfied. Nevertheless, most accepted his reign, preferring a living Targaryen king to no Targaryen presence at all. After months of tireless effort, King's Landing began to look like a city on the mend. The rubble was cleared from main thoroughfares. Walls were partially rebuilt. Markets reopened, albeit with fewer goods than before. People started to smile again, albeit tentatively. News from across Westeros indicated similar progress. Though scars from the wars remained, especially in smaller villages ravaged by passing armies, the realm was, for the first time in years, largely at peace. Amid these developments, a date was finally set for Jon's coronation. It would be a smaller ceremony than those in previous generations, reflecting the humility and the battered state of the realm. Jon balked at the idea of pomp, but Tyrion insisted that a formal recognition would help solidify his legitimacy and reassure the people. The site chosen was not the Red Keep's throne room, still under repair, nor the Great September of Baelor, which lay in rubble from Cersei's wildfire. Instead, it was the ruins of the Dragon Pit, a symbolic place where Targaryen power once stood. The roof was gone, the structure partially collapsed, but enough remained to stage a simple ceremony. It would be open to the sky, a reminder that the realm now embraced a new openness, free from secrets and tyranny. The day of the coronation dawned with a clear sky, a gentle wind blowing through the city. Delegations from every corner of Westeros arrived to witness the moment. The seats in the crumbling stands of the dragon pit were filled with lords and ladies, knights and counselors, as well as a selection of common folk invited to observe, another departure from tradition. The atmosphere was subdued yet charged with hope. Jon arrived dressed not in ostentatious finery, but in a polished leather doublet bearing a simple sigil, a dire wolf and a dragon entwined, representing the union of Stark and Targaryen. He wore a plain black cloak clasped at the shoulder by a small silver pin shaped like a wolf's head, a gift from Arya. Many in attendance noted the understated nature of his attire, especially compared to previous monarchs who wore gold thread and jeweled crowns even before being crowned. Sansa and Arya stood in the front row of observers, solemn yet supportive. Bran was nearby, his gaze distant as always. Tyrion, acting as hand, guided Jon to a small dais surrounded by solemn-faced Kingsguard, Brienne foremost among them. Samwell Tarly stepped forward, book in hand, to conduct the ceremony. The hush in the dragon pit was profound, broken only by the rustle of cloaks and the shuffle of feet on the dusty ground. Samwell, in his new role as Grand Maester, began with a short speech about the history of the Targaryen dynasty, how it rose to unify the realm with dragons, and how it nearly destroyed itself. He spoke of the lessons learned, how the greatest threat to the living had not been petty rivalries but the undead. He recounted Jon's role in that war, culminating in the reveal of his parentage. Then, in a simple, direct manner, he asked Jon to kneel. Jon hesitated for a fraction of a second. Kneeling to accept a crown felt strange to him. He had been a reluctant leader all his life. But he did so, resting one knee upon the worn stones. Sam lifted a plain steel circlet, unadorned by jewels or embellishments, forged from the remains of a Stark sword and a Targaryen blade that had been broken in the wars. It was a symbolic new crown, representing both houses, yet free of the extravagance that had marked the monarchy in the past. Carefully, Sam placed it upon Jon's head. "Rise, Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name," Sam pronounced, using a shortened form of the ancient style. "King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the realm. May your reign bring peace and justice to all the peoples of Westeros." Jon stood slowly, the circlet not heavy, but the responsibility it represented immense. He turned to face the assembled crowd. The applause began softly, then grew in waves, though it never reached the thunderous roar of old coronations. There was respect, some hope, but also the knowledge that the realm was still healing. Jon bowed his head in acknowledgement, then spoke, his voice echoing across the broken dome of the dragon pit. "I accept this crown, not as a prize, but as a duty," he said. "We have all witnessed how power can corrupt, and how conflict can tear us apart. I vow to rule with humility, to listen to my counsel, and to protect the realm from threats both within and beyond our borders. May the Seven watch over us, or the old gods guide us, whichever faith we hold, and may we never forget the lessons of the past." Another ripple of applause followed, mingled with the wind that whistled through the crumbling arches. Then, in an act that surprised many, Jon stepped off the dais and moved among the people, shaking hands, exchanging a few words with common folk as well as lords. It was a simple gesture, yet it resonated powerfully in a realm accustomed to distant, aloof monarchs. He made sure to speak with a handful of the city's small folk, some of whom had lived through the worst days of Daenerys' final rampage, others who had survived the War of the Five Kings. He offered them quiet reassurances, and though not all believed him at once, the sincerity in his eyes left a mark. In the days that followed, the coronation set a new tone across Westeros. Jon was no longer the unnamed bastard who had once served in the Night's Watch, nor merely the reluctant king in the north. He was the recognized king of the Seven Kingdoms, supported by a broad coalition of lords who, despite lingering reservations, chose unity over further strife. Every raven that flew across the skies carried the news. A Targaryen once again sat the throne, but this time, a Targaryen who bore the blood of Stark, who valued the words of his council, and who had proven himself in the darkest hour of the realm. Of course, challenges lay ahead. Pockets of banditry, still roaming the riverlands, needed to be stamped out. Trade routes to Essos remained tenuous, especially with the scars left by Daenerys' abrupt departure and the chaos in the free cities. Religious tensions simmered, as some zealots of the faith still branded Targaryens as heretics. The question of heirs loomed. Jon had no queen, and the line of succession was unclear. Many lords whispered about the need for him to secure a marriage to stabilize alliances and ensure continuity. Jon, however, found the thought of marriage heavy with emotional baggage, still grieving the loss of those he had loved. He postponed any discussion on the matter, focusing instead on pressing governance issues. Months slipped into a year, and under Jon's reign, Westeros continued to heal. The roads became safer. Harvests improved with better coordination between the regions. The King's Council, composed of representatives from each major region, evolved into a more formal body that met regularly to shape policy. And though Jon sat in the seat of ultimate authority, he devolved much power to local lords, ensuring they had a vested interest in the stability and prosperity of the realm. Gradually, old hatreds dulled, replaced by a cautious belief that perhaps, after all the suffering, they could find a measure of peace. Winter eventually faded, giving way to a promising spring. The winds that howled beyond the wall subsided, and reports from the Night's Watch indicated that the realms of men were no longer threatened by the undead. The wildlings, permitted to settle in the Gift, cultivated small farms and learned to trade with northern towns. There were tensions, but far fewer than before. The era of the Night King was a memory, a shared trauma that bound all men of the realm together. Through it all, Jon never quite grew comfortable with the crown. He performed his duties with diligence, guided by the quiet moral compass he had always possessed. His seat in the Red Keep was plain. The Iron Throne itself remained a twisted relic in the throne room, more a monument to what had been destroyed. Some urged him to sit upon it symbolically. Occasionally, he did so in official ceremonies, but he preferred to hold court in simpler settings. People began to call him the Unwanted King, half in jest, half with respect, for everyone knew he had never sought the position. And in that reluctance, they found reassurance, for a man who did not crave power was less likely to abuse it. Sansa, seeing the slow but steady improvement in King's Landing, decided to return to Winterfell. She believed her efforts were best spent revitalizing the North, ensuring it thrived under the new era. They parted with mutual understanding, siblings by upbringing yet forever changed by the revelations. Arya left soon after, heading west from the harbor of Old Town on a small ship, seeking lands unknown. Bran remained in the capital for a time, though eventually he, too, journeyed northward, drawn by the ancient powers of the Weirwoods. Tyrion stayed at Jon's side, as did Davos, Samwell, and Brienne, each fulfilling roles critical to the kingdom's administration. As the second year of Jon's reign commenced, word reached King's Landing of fresh tensions arising in the free cities, where mercenary companies vied for control. Some Essosi powers still eyed Westeros with suspicion, remembering Daenerys Targaryen's crusade against slavery. Jon's council debated whether to intervene diplomatically or remain neutral. The scars of foreign wars weighed on their minds, but so did the moral imperative to oppose slavery. The final decision was a measured approach: diplomatic missions, careful negotiations, and an offer to resettle escaped slaves in the newly cleared lands near Harrenhal. It was a bold policy, not universally popular, yet it demonstrated the realm's new stance. Westeros would no longer be an isolated, warring cluster of feudal kingdoms, but a united monarchy willing to champion certain principles abroad. Trade ships began arriving more frequently from Pentos, Bravos, and beyond, bringing goods, knowledge, and occasional trouble. But overall, commerce expanded, and the realm saw an influx of new ideas. Maesters at the Citadel found fresh impetus to record the recent history, compiling texts about the Long Night, the war against the dead, and the crowning of a Targaryen Stark king. Jon himself became a figure of curiosity among Essosi travelers, who told tales of the king who knelt to save the realm, the man who returned from death, the ruler with ice and fire in his blood. In King's Landing, the slow reconstruction of the Red Keep advanced. Craftsmen labored to restore certain wings, though Jon refrained from reinstating the more ostentatious chambers of the old Targaryen dynasty. He had them converted into libraries, meeting rooms, and living quarters for key officials. A few older courtiers grumbled that the monarchy was becoming too plain, lacking the grandiosity befitting a king. But many younger nobles and commoners found inspiration in the shift, less focus on towering statues and shining marble, more on practical governance and the well-being of the population. Among those who felt uneasy with the new direction were certain lords who profited handsomely from the old ways of power, where strong houses could leverage their might to wrest privileges from a weak king. They murmured amongst themselves about orchestrating a return to the status quo, maybe even a coup or a rebellion, but no strong figure emerged to lead them. The realm's memory of devastation was too fresh. A few half-hearted conspiracies were exposed and swiftly dealt with, not with mass executions but with confiscation of lands or seats on councils under strict oversight. Jon, showing clemency, allowed the conspirators to keep their titles if they pledged renewed loyalty and paid hefty fines to the crown's rebuilding coffers. The measure earned him both resentment from the powerful and gratitude from the common folk, who saw an end to cycles of bloody retribution. The seasons continued their turn, and as the realm steadied, Jon found moments of personal reflection. Sometimes he rode out to the Rose Road, accompanied by Ghost, his loyal direwolf, who had stayed by his side throughout the transition to kingship. Together, they would traverse farmland, small villages, meeting the people he governed. These journeys, unannounced and humble, reminded Jon of his own humanity, the fact that he was not a distant symbol, but a living man with a duty of care. He found joy in small acts, such as granting farmland to war orphans, or listening to an old granny's tale about how she survived the siege. Word reached him occasionally of Drogon, the last dragon. Sightings in the Far East, glimpses of a black shape crossing the sky. Jon felt a lingering sadness at how that bond with the last living dragon could have developed, but he understood that Drogon's departure was in many ways a mercy. The realm was not ready for dragons, not yet. Perhaps there would come a time when the Targaryen lineage of dragons and men could be reconciled, but for now, the realm needed to heal and rebuild without the specter of fire. By the time his third year on the throne had begun, the changes were visible. King's Landing was a city reborn, more modest than before but more stable. The crown's finances, though still not flush with gold, were no longer on the brink of collapse. Roads that had fallen into disrepair were being restored, fostering trade and communication. The small council had developed a routine of meeting regularly to address disputes and pass laws. Local lords took pride in maintaining order, partly because they were included in the governance process rather than feeling subjugated by a distant king. Every region felt the benefit of collaboration, if not entirely free of suspicion. It was in these quieter days that Jon reflected on how the Great Council had changed his life, and possibly the fate of Westeros. By revealing his Targaryen blood openly, by humbling himself before the lords, and by submitting to their judgment, he had garnered a legitimacy that no conqueror could force. Instead of another spasm of war, the realm had chosen a man who carried both the legacy of dragons and the honor of wolves, someone neither too proud to listen nor too weak to act. He still carried private griefs. The loss of those dear to him, Ygritte, Daenerys, those who had fought and died in his wars, remained a wound in his heart. But he channeled those sorrows into compassion for the living. Whenever a dispute escalated, whenever a decision risked igniting old hatreds, he recalled the people who had paid the price for mistakes and secrets, and he would seek a peaceful route, a compromise, or a measured response. Not every crisis was resolved easily, and at times he had to wield the crown's power decisively. Yet even when he had no choice but to unleash the royal armies against brigands or quell a budding rebellion, he did so with regret, not relish. As the years stretched on, the realm inched toward a better future. Children grew up hearing stories of the war against the dead and the forging of a new peace. The songs still celebrated dragons and direwolves, heroes and villains, but there was a new note, a king who had knelt before his people to earn their trust, and who kept faith even after gaining power. Some old illusions, of course, lingered. Some believed that a rightful king must display might and awe, forging fear rather than trust. But time and success proved them increasingly marginalized. In all of it, Jon remained what he had always been. A man driven by duty, shaped by the North, and tempered by the blood of dragons. Each morning he rose with the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Each night he found solace in small mercies and the knowledge that, for now at least, the realm was safe. He was not naive. He knew future generations would face their own trials, that the seeds of conflict might sprout anew. But he hoped that the foundations laid under his reign would be strong enough to withstand storms, that the memory of unity against the greatest threat of all would not be forgotten. And so he reigned, Aegon Targaryen VI, called by some the White Wolf, by others the Reluctant Dragon, but by most simply Jon. A king who, by revealing the truth of his heritage, had claimed the Iron Throne not with a roar of fire but with a quiet promise of peace. And in that promise, and in the actions that followed, he offered Westeros its best chance at long-term stability in living memory. Indeed, perhaps the greatest testament to his kingship was that, for the first time in a long age, the realm found itself moving toward a future not dominated by the thunder of war drums, but guided by the steady heartbeat of hope.